Hey guys, so today we are talking about the Canon 5D Mark II, and this is a camera that is almost 15 years old now, and when it did come out almost 15 years ago, it completely changed the digital camera industry, and I actually just got a chance to shoot with it for the first time for a few weeks, and this is definitely not a modern spec'd out mirrorless camera. But if you are in the market for a great camera that you can easily get for under 500 bucks, this might be an interesting option for you. Alright, so I'm just going to cover some of the basic specs to know about this camera. And first of all, it is a 21.1 megapixel sensor, which is honestly still a great value considering that, for instance, Canon's R6, which is one of its current mirrorless full frame cameras, is actually only 20 megapixels, and that camera costs about $2,500. And this is a DSLR, the 5D Mark II. And for those of you that are new to photography, what a DSLR means is that when you look through the viewfinder, you're actually looking at an image that is produced through a mirror versus a mirrorless camera, which, as the name suggests, doesn't have a mirror. So with a mirrorless camera, you're looking directly at the image that's being taken off the sensor. With a DSLR, you don't actually see the image until after the image has already been taken, which is actually a great way to learn about photography and understand your camera settings, but it does of course have its limitations as well. For instance, if you are shooting through the viewfinder, you only have 9 autofocus points with the 5D Mark II, and technically you can still shoot the image directly off the sensor if you're shooting on the back screen through live view. However, in live view, this camera has a really slow and outdated contrast detect based autofocus system, and realistically, you are not going to be autofocusing off of the live view mode on this camera. For photography, we can also shoot bursts up to 3.9 frames per second, and this camera does shoot video, which at the time was what made it so popular, because it can shoot 1080 at 30 frames and 24 frames per second, but you are not going to have any continuous autofocus in video. And then the camera also does use one single CF card as the memory card. So as far as ergonomics go on this camera, it is really close to perfect. And I mean, the 5D line of DSLRs is what most photographers are going to use as kind of the standard to measure ergonomics of cameras against. You have a big beefy grip. It's a full-size DSLR, so you also have plenty of buttons and dials, and if you want more to that camera, you can also get a battery grip to add onto it. So the 5D Mark II uses the LPE6 battery from Canon, and this was the first camera in the 5D series to use that battery, and that battery is actually in newer versions of that battery what Canon uses in their current full frame mirrorless cameras, and all of those batteries are backwards and forwards compatible, so it's really nice to have the same battery system for almost 15 years now. So the viewfinder covers 98% of the image sensor, and that's another limitation that you had with DSLRs, especially at this time, because back then it was still kind of difficult and expensive to create a viewfinder that covered exactly 100% of the image sensor, because again, you're not looking directly at the image on the sensor, you're looking through the viewfinder and seeing what's reflected through a mirror. So in practical terms, what this means is that the image that you actually take is going to be slightly wider than what you see through the viewfinder. So this camera doesn't have any of the modern features like a flip out screen, but we do have a joystick to control your autofocus point. There's a USB port, but you can't charge the battery through the USB port. There's a HDMI mini output. We have a mic jack, remote shutter port, old school flash sync port on the camera, and this camera has Canon's EF mount, which is still the mount with the widest selections of lenses natively available to it. So let's talk about photography, and this is definitely a mainly photo camera. That's how it was designed as well. And again, we have a 21 megapixel sensor in this camera, and honestly, that's still pretty comparable to current sensors on the market. I'd say around 24 megapixels is probably the average for camera bodies that aren't meant to be high resolution cameras. And 21 megapixels is still plenty. and you can even crop a decent amount, especially if you are only posting to social media or online somewhere. So the images coming off of this camera have really great colors and actually look great even just straight out of camera. You have a lot of flexibility in editing. I was surprised at the amount of dynamic range that this camera had in its photos. The shadow detail that you can pull back, I will say it's not going to be able to pull back highlights as much, so I would shoot a little bit darker to protect your highlights, but that's honestly not that unusual for digital cameras anyway. And when I'm talking about the amount of dynamic range that you have with these images, I'm talking specifically when you're shooting at lower ISO values. But I want to kind of emphasize the experience of shooting with this camera, and I'll say it was nice and fun to be shooting with a DSLR again. And again, there are limitations here. You only have 9 autofocus points, and that can definitely be restrictive. I will say about the autofocus points, they actually performed really well, better than I thought they were going to. Shooting a lot of stuff at f2.8 and even a few shots at f1.4, and there were very, very few shots that were out of focus. But again, because of only having 9 autofocus points, that can be very restrictive, and you will a lot of times have to build your composition around where autofocus points are. You can use techniques like focus and recompose, which by the way, I absolutely hate. If you don't know what that is, that means you're using an autofocus point to set your focus and then holding that focus and moving the camera to get your composition. And it's frustrating. It's something that you had to do with these older cameras a lot of times because of having fewer autofocus points. But if you move at all or your subject moves at all, it's really easy for your image to come out of focus, and I don't enjoy that particularly. But overall, especially if you are able to take your time, this is a fun way of shooting on an older DSLR like this, because you do have to slow down. You have to be a little more methodical and planned out with your shots. And that is really just helpful to focus more on the process and think more about what you're shooting. Now, being an older camera like this, it does use CF cards instead of SD cards for memory. And honestly, I don't think that's a problem at all. It's just something that's different. And the price of CF cards right now is pretty low, and they're still really easy to find, so it's not really a problem. It's just something different. Autofocus in live view on the back screen of this camera is just not usable at all. However, it does have exposure simulation, so if you want to make sure that your exposure is right, you can get that through live view, have your exposure set, and then go back through the viewfinder to actually take your shot. Again, that's a slower way of shooting, but that's again something that's going to help you slow down, be more methodical about how you're shooting, and put you more into the process of your shot. And I think this is a really great tool for someone who wants to get into shooting full frame on a lower budget. I would definitely suggest use this for shooting something where you have good lighting. Although I will say, I do have a friend who still shoots with the 5D Mark II and shoots events and things in dark lighting and still has images that look really nice, but that takes a lot of skill and a lot of time in post-processing to get images that are going to be usable off of this camera sensor. So I would definitely suggest shooting with a lot of light. So when it comes to video, this is interesting because the reason the 5D Mark II was famous was because of its video features. But by today's standards, it's definitely not great for video. You can shoot 1080 at 24 or 30 frames per second, but there's no option for slow motion. It does produce good looking footage. It definitely has that indie film kind of look to it, which is probably because so many indie films were shot on this camera specifically. But the footage itself is line skipped 8-bit 1080, and it was also Canon's first 1080 video on a DSLR. And because of that, for instance, some of the controls are pretty strange. It took me a minute to get used to it. However, I had the settings when I first started shooting. The exposure was changing after I started taking the shot for some reason. I did eventually figure the settings out, but it's not a great menu experience for video, and also there's no continuous autofocus in video. Now, I do want to bring up the fact that apparently like an entire episode of the show House was shot on this camera, and seen some footage from like the Avengers movie was shot on this. But keep in mind that those were big sets, big productions where one person's operating the camera, one person's pulling focus, you have a team doing lighting. This is not a very good option for shooting by yourself. Now, if you want a manual focus and you're used to that, you can get decent looking footage from this camera, but this is definitely not something I would suggest if you are primarily a video shooter. So who is this camera for? And I think this is actually a really interesting value for photographers who are trying to shoot full frame on a budget. I think if you are on a $1,500 budget for your entire setup, this 5D Mark II and then $1,000 worth of used L glass on the EF mount is going to get you much better image quality than getting, say, a $1,500 modern camera with the kit lens. And I do think that this camera is going to do much better for someone who's shooting in a situation where they can take more time and be methodical. So maybe portrait shooters, but definitely stuff like still life, product photography, food photography, landscape photographers. This camera is definitely not going to be a good option for action shooting, any type of action. This is not what this camera is going to excel at. It also only has that one memory card slot, which is definitely not something that wedding and event shooters like to see. And again, it is not my recommendation for solo video shooters. But anyway, I hope you liked this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments below. Are you thinking about looking into getting this camera now as a used camera to get into full frame photography? Have you shot with this camera before? Was this maybe one of the cameras that you started off with almost 15 years ago? Let me know in the comments below. Again, if you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button. See ya.